This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Major League Baseball's long enjoyed being an entity unto its own. No competition. No other startup leagues. Unlike the NFL, which has faced multiple startups over the years, the NBA, which staved off the ABA, and the NHL, which faced competition from the WHA. But there was a time when Major League Baseball did face a test. 1914 and 1915. The Federal League tried to make a go of it. And next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we'll take a look back at the Federal League and all that it involved.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 134, the Federal League. Joining me on today's show is baseball historian and author Dan Levitt. Dan probably knows more about the Federal League than just about anyone. He is a true treasure trove of information, and our conversation only touched the surface of what could have been hours of discussion. The Federal League was actually formed in 1913 as a minor league, but a group of ambitious men wanted more and decided to take on the National and American Leagues, which, in their own right, were separate entities, and set out to form a third major league. In 1914 and 15, the Federal League operated as a major league, and it poached many players from their rivals. The competition, well, it was pretty good, and with teams in such places as Chicago, Brooklyn, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis, the Federal League had high hopes. But poor attendance and high salaries doomed the league, and it was unable to sustain a profitable operation, and we are going to get into a lot of this with Dan. Before we do, however, a few reminders. Please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes. Follow on Facebook at Sports Forgotten Heroes, and please, wherever you listen, give Sports Forgotten Heroes a 5-star rating, and if you can, a nice review. Don't forget, not only can you listen here, you can also watch on YouTube at Sports Forgotten Heroes. Okay, let's get into today's show with my guest, Dan Levitt. Dan, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you're here.
Hey, great to be here.
This is really a fun topic, the Federal League. It's something that I've been interested for such a long time and have debated whether or not to pursue an episode on the Federal League because, as you know, the name of the podcast is Sports Forgotten Heroes. And I talk about stars whom time has forgotten, teams whom time has forgotten. And when you look back at it, the Federal League sort of fits that mold. It is something that I'm quite sure not everybody knows about and that time has forgotten. And as we are recording this is the great game this evening between the Giants and the Cardinals at Rickwood Field. So I think everything sort of plays, the Negro Leagues, the Federal League. So it's great timing for this. And I'm really glad to have you aboard. I wanted to start with this. What fascinates you so much about the history of the Federal League?
Well, it's a wonderful what-if story because, as you know, it was the last league to challenge Major League Baseball on the field, sort of like the ABA in basketball or the AFL in football. And both of those succeeded to some degree. I mean, the AFL got a full merger. The ABA got at least a couple teams in. Then you had the World Hockey League that, got a couple of teams into the NHL. And World Hockey Association, excuse me, the LWHA. And, we had a team here in St. Paul. So
yeah, the Minnesota Fighting Saints.
Yeah, that was a fun team. Anyway, so, what is it about the Federal League that they didn't succeed and no one else could ever challenge baseball again? And so it's just a fascinating story from a perspective of, again, the what if. That makes it kind of fun. And then, of course, there was a tremendous amount of intrigue in the 2 years. So it was a major league, or a putative major league anyway, in 1914 and 1915. And the battles between the leagues and then sort of within the leagues, too, as you had fighting between the national and the American and the federal. So within the leagues as well. So there was just a lot of inside scoop that just made it a really fun story.
What, as a baseball fan, is something we should all know about the Federal League that perhaps we don't?
Well, I mean, maybe people know this, but I mean, it was the court cases coming out of the collapse of the Federal League that gave baseball its antitrust exemption, which has been, I think, one of the key reasons that no other league has been able to challenge it on the field. In 1957, the Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, the other sports which had been acting as if they also had this antitrust exemption did not have that antitrust exemption. And I think that was a big reason why, again, these other leagues could succeed and nothing could ever challenge baseball on the field in that way.
I don't want to get into all these politics and all, but that is such an interesting point, because why is baseball different than the other sports in that perspective? Why is baseball able to do this and fight off that? Well, no one else is. I guess the closest thing that came was the Mexican League, but why is baseball exempt as opposed to these other leagues in such a manner?
Well, a couple of things. One, the other league that tried to get off, besides the Mexican League, was the Continental League in around 1959, 1960, which effectively it never got off the ground. They were trying to start. Branch Rickey, the famous GM, was the president of the commissioner, president of the league, whoever they wanted to call it, and they never got off the ground. But it did force, in many ways, the major leagues to expand, and it got the National League, the New York team, the New York National League franchise again, and the Mets. I mean, the main thing it did was it forced it. I would say a couple things. One is that the case went to the Supreme Court in 1922, and the Supreme Court in 1922 was a lot different than it evolved in the 50s into today, and it was much more conservative, obviously, in many ways, and one of which is the way it viewed interstate commerce. And to be required to be under the antitrust laws, I mean, to be under any law of commerce, you had to be both interstate and you had to be commerce. And the court ruled that baseball was not commerce in the sense that it was people playing it, it was people playing a game, and that was not commerce. And that the act of moving between cities to play these games did not make it interstate, that was just, I think the word they used was incidental. That was just incidental to this. So in fact, the courts ruled that it was not commerce and it was not interstate. So it was not subject to the congressional rules of and the antitrust rules passed by Congress. Now, there's been a lot of, I'm not a lawyer. I'm more into the business side, but obviously the legal part of this is huge. And I've read a lot on this. And what's interesting is that, there's a lot of debate even today and at the time whether or not this was sort of an anomalous ruling or whether this was sort of typical for the court of that time. And I firmly come down on the side that this was typical for the law of that time. There was a lot of other rulings that were similar in terms of what was interstate and what was commerce. And it wasn't until later in the 30s when you had sort of the part of the New Deal and a little bit of the later courts where this much broader definition of what was interstate and what was commerce was coming. So that to me, and essentially the court never wanted to overrule its previous ruling. It was, it came up in around 1950, and then of course the Curt Flood case, where Curt Flood in late 1960s, and then it went to the Supreme Court in the early 1970s, challenged the baseball's antitrust exemption, and the court said, we're not going to overturn our previous ruling. If Congress wants to overturn this and say that they want to do it, that's fine. But the court had a couple of chances to overturn it and never really did.
Interesting. Yeah, and but again, it's just weird that baseball gets away with it, but the other sports don't. You had the American Football League, which of course is probably the most successful of all. As they became the AFC, and you had so many teams go over, and then, like you said, the ABA had four, and the WHA had four, and you have all these spring football leagues now, always trying to make it. The USFL tried to make it, and won that court case, but $3 isn't gonna win you much. While this is not a review of your book, The Outlaw League and the Battle That Forged Modern Baseball, how difficult was it for you to find information for it? And while that might have been difficult, how fun was it as well?
Well, it's a lot of fun. I mean, I'm a baseball historian, and digging into stuff is great. And I mean, there was really two sources that were relatively new and hadn't really been mined in this capacity. And the first was the Gary Herman papers at the Hall of Fame. Gary Herman was one of the three members of the National Commission. He was the head of the commission. So before the baseball had a commissioner when Landis came, Judge Landis, who was the first commissioner at the end of 1920, you basically had this national commission. So baseball was run by three people. It was the president of the National League, the president of the American League, and Gary Herman, who was he was not the major owner of the Reds, but he was effectively the president of the Reds and ran the Cincinnati Reds. And all of his correspondence was donated to the Hall of Fame. And by just about the time I was writing my book, just sort of in the early 2000s, the Hall of Fame had just started to catalog all this stuff. So you had all of these letters between the team owners and the president, or the team owners. So you had these letters between the owners saying, here's what we think a settlement needs to be, or here's who the really bad guys are, and here's what we need to do, and we need to blacklist this person, and here's what the Federal League just offered us. So you actually had the letters, you had the primary sources that had never really been gone through. And so a lot of my book is based on these primary sources of letters between owners, which is really fun to have seen. And then the other thing is a lot of these court cases. So there was two main court cases. The one I just talked about was the Supreme Court case. But before that, obviously, there was an initial ruling which actually went in favor of the Baltimore team of the Federal League, which brought the suit. It was then overturned on appeal, and then the Supreme Court supported the appeal, which overturned the ruling, so saying that it was not, in fact, antitrust. And then there was a case between 1914 and 1915, and we're kind of taking the story a little bit out of order, but hopefully it still makes sense. So between 1914, which was the first year of the Federal League as a putative major league, and 1915, the Federal League filed an antitrust challenge in federal court in Chicago. And the judge of that was Judge Kennesaw Mountain Lantis, who later became the commissioner, because the owners liked the way that he treated that, which in fact was he just sort of pocketed the deal, because I think he recognized that it probably was that the organized baseball, the National League and the American League were in fact violating antitrust laws, and he didn't rule so that they weren't punished for all of their violations. And again, the kind of violations we're talking about are things like a blacklist. I mean, this is kind of some of the stuff why the AFL may have succeeded. So if the NFL had said anyone who ever plays in the NFL is now blacklisted from ever playing for us, that would have made players much less likely. They could denigrate the Federal Leagues. Basically, the Federal League's never going to succeed. If the player signed with the Federal League, the baseball would denigrate them to the press, talk about how these players were traitors and evil people. And so they just brought the full weight of the baseball organization within America down on this very small group of players who were trying to jump. And that was so anyway. This court case, I'm digressing a little bit, but the court case that Judge Landis had thousands of documents, and they're still in a Chicago courthouse, and they're now online. But at the time I did this, I went down to the Chicago courthouse, and I, went through the couple thousand documents, and there was all the affidavits of all the players of saying, here's what the owners did to me, or here's what I signed. So you had all these affidavits of all. So I wasn't really looking for the ruling so much as I was just looking what was going into these affidavits and what people were saying was happening, and stuff that had never been in the papers that was these players' affidavits and owners' affidavits and everybody's commentary on what was happening.
What was the impetus for forming the Federal League? Was there really a need? Was there a need for it? And how did it initially affect the National and American leagues?
Well, I think it was a legitimate try at a business. And I think if they'd known how hard the National and the American leagues were going to come down on them without any restraint of trade for antitrust, they might have not done it. But you have to understand a couple of things. The urban population of the United States increased more than fourfold between 1870 and 1910. There were in 1870 there were 4 cities with more than 300,000 people. By 1910, there were 18 cities with more than 300,000 people. So you had this massive growth in urban population, and then there had been examples of leagues that had succeeded. The American Association came in 1882 and challenged the National League in 1882, and they succeeded. I mean, they made it till 1891 when a bunch of stuff drove them out of business, but they succeeded. And then, of course, the American League in 1901. So, less than 15 years earlier, succeeded for a number of reasons. They had a number of advantages the Federal League didn't have, one of which was complete disorganization in the National League in 1901. And they had a great leader in Ban Johnson. Charlie Summers, who owned the Cleveland Indians, funded a bunch of teams to the tune of about $1 million. But if from a distance, there was no reason to think you had this massive population growth in the U.S., and you had a couple of reasonable examples of teams that had succeeded. Plus, one other thing, teams, the franchises have gone up tremendously in value. Around 1900 to 1905, teams are valued at about $150,000, and by 1912, 1914, they were valued at about $400,000. So clearly, something was happening.
Right. Well, where I wanted to go, you actually just sort of touched upon it. The National League and the American League. Baseball was different back then. I don't know how many people actually know this, but it wasn't Major League Baseball like we know today. The reason the National League is called the Senior Circuit is because the National League was around before the American League, thus the Junior Circuit. So can you talk maybe a little bit about how Major League Baseball was actually set up back then, how the National and American leagues were sort of two different entities and how they finally came together? Because another thing that, it sort of went away gradually. There used to be a president of the National League, right, and there used to be a president of the American League. And I don't know, somewhere in the 70s or early 80s, that all went away and became, one entity.
Yeah, I think it didn't actually formally, I'd have to go back and look, formally become one entity until maybe up until the early 90s. But by that point, obviously, the league presidents had lost power. But no, the league presidents were extremely powerful. These leagues, they respected each other's contracts, right? They didn't sign players from each other's teams. They respected each other's territorial rights, but they were rivals. There was no interleague trading. You couldn't trade between the leagues unless a player went through waivers. So, they were very distinct entities. But I think another key is how they related to the minor leagues, because the minor leagues are a huge part of this story too with the Federal League. At the time, unlike today, the minor leagues were fully independent. The major leagues did not control the minor leagues. There was no such thing as a farm system. The minor leagues wanted to win for their city just as much as a major league team. But there was a national agreement that tied everything together. In other words, you respected each other's contracts, including the reserve clause, which we can talk about for a minute too. You respected each other's territorial rights. So when something's called an outlaw league, it meant it was not part of the national agreement, and it didn't necessarily have to abide by other teams' territorial rights, and it didn't have to abide by their player contracts. So that was the key, is, how do you get players, is you get players from other major league or minor league teams. And in fact, when you look at it, the National League was hurt more than the American League, but the teams that were really hurt were the high minors, because in some of the cities, like Baltimore, for example, which was a minor league team at the time, had a federal league team. And you look at these attendance figures, the Federals were maybe drawing 3,000 people to a game. And if the International League team, which was the minor league team, had a game that day, maybe they were drawing 50 people. I mean, it was just the fans in these cities wanted to be major league. And we can talk about some of that too, but that was key for these minor league cities that there were 4 teams in the federal, there were 8 teams in the Federal League, like there were in the National and the American, and 4 of them competed with minor league teams, and 4 of them competed with major league teams.
Well, we're going to get there because I do want to talk a little bit about the attendance in those cities where there were where there was major league teams and the Federal League. But speaking of minor leagues, wasn't the Federal League first originally 1913 a minor league? And again, what was the thought about, hey, let's turn this into a major league? And just because someone says we are a major league, does that make it a major league? Why was it recognized as such?
Well, yeah, in 1913, it was they were in larger cities. They were in Chicago, they were in Cleveland. But it was basically it was like a low minor leagues in terms of the players that they had, and a number of the owners just felt like, let's take a shot at this. We seem to be able to make this happen, and a lot happened. I mean, the league that was the Federal League minor league team in 1913 was very different from what would have been there, say, in April of 1914. One of the key things they did is that they brought in a guy named James Gilmore, who was a Chicago businessman and was said to be a great salesman. They kicked out their existing league president in about June, maybe July, and they brought in Gilmore. And they said, Gilmore, you take this on. And he went out and he found some rich owners. There were no really rich owners in the Federal League in June of 1913. And Gilmore, he went out and he brought in Charlie Wiegman in Chicago, who was a rich restaurateur. Most notably, he brought in a guy named Robert Ward in New York, or actually in Brooklyn, who was sort of the angel for the league and funded all the teams as much as he could. He had a wealthy guy, Edward Gwinner, in Pittsburgh, and then I'm blanking out. And then he had Phil Ball in St. Louis, right? Thank you. And what's interesting is that in the 4 cities that competed with the major leagues, he had well-heeled owners. But again, this, going back to your original question, this took place between sort of the fall of 1913 all the way up until, I mean, he didn't get Ward and Gwinner up until like February of 1914. And so there was a lot going on in here. It wasn't clear exactly what the Federal League was going to look like.
You just touched upon my next question, which was the men behind the formation of the Federal League. And I still want to hit upon that. I'm going to mention their name, and you just tell me a little bit more about them. And let's start with James Gilmore. Who was he, and what was his role in the Federal League?
Well, Gilmore was an executive with a fan manufacturing company, and he wasn't extremely rich in and of himself, but he was a great salesman. He knew everybody in Chicago, and he was basically the driving force, like I was saying, of going out and finding owners, at least 4 who were wealthy. I mean, if he hadn't brought those 4 in, it's hard to believe how the Federal League would have even survived that first year. And he was the public face. I mean, he was the one talking to the press, and so he was. I mean, he was the key. I wouldn't say he was the driving force. Charlie Wiegman, Robert Ward were important characters, but there's no question that Gilmore was a very, very key executive there.
And how about Charlie Wiegman? Tell us a little more about it.
Wiegman, I mean, he was your quintessential restaurateur. He had a bunch of these little restaurants, sort of what went for fast food at the time. They were these restaurants where you got food out of a machine, and he built this. He sort of built this up from scratch. And he had a string of a whole lot of restaurants around Chicago and knew everybody, and was just he was just a guy who loved being in the limelight. And one of the things Wiegman understood was that there was an opportunity on the north side of Chicago. At the time, don't forget, the Cubs played sort of on the old west side of Chicago. I think there's a hospital there now. It's within a mile of where the Bulls and the Blackhawks played. I mean, sort of on that near west side. That's where the Cubs played. And there was something like 800,000 people on the north side of Chicago at the time, which was bigger than any city in America except for New York. And the train had just the L train had just at that time gotten up there. So when he got a site up there, which he had to fight to get a site. I mean, there was a lot of shenanigans about how he could get control of the site, and he built the ballpark, which he named Federal League Park, and it was Weigman Park for a little while after that too. Now it obviously is known as Wrigley Field, but Weigman, that was the key thing. I mean, and the Chicago franchise was the key. It was the key franchise in the Federal League. They clearly outdrew the Cubs. They may have outdrawn the White Sox, which at the time, and it was the bellwether franchise, and that was the franchise that sort of made everything else work as well as it did.
How about the other two, Ward and Ball? Tell us a little more about Ball.
Well, Ball was a fascinating guy too. I mean, all these guys were sort of self-made men. I mean, Ball sort of traveled the country. His dad owned an ice plant business. Ball eventually bought the ice plant business, and then he actually recognized sort of the transformational impact that refrigeration was making. So he got into refrigeration. So Ball was an early refrigeration entrepreneur, made his money that way, and so all these guys are really interesting characters. I mean, they were all very outgoing. They loved talking. A lot of them had spent, their youth wandering around the country, just meeting people. And, the world was a different place then, right? I mean, people kind of left home and wandered off. And, Ball he wasn't a great ball player, but he wasn't bad. He had his hand almost cut off in a knife fight. So that ended his ball playing career. So, I mean, these were characters. Ward basically became the biggest bread manufacturer in the United States. And at the time, people were worried about the cleanliness of food. I mean, anyone who's read The Jungle, I mean, food safety at the time was a huge issue. And Ball sort of came up with this mechanical way to make bread. There was a phrase, something like, from the factory to you without ever touching human hands, right? He figured out a way to do this mechanically. And so he just had this, it was called Tip Top Bread. And he became, he was the richest of any of them, and probably as rich as any owner in either league. And he was sort of the angel that funded 3 or 4 of these teams, especially the ones which I'm sure maybe you'll ask me about next, in some of the minor league cities that did not have the rich owners.
Well, where I am going to go next is you could call yourself a major league, you could call yourself whatever you want, but if you don't have the talent, you're not a major league. How did they attract major league ball players from the National League and players from the American League? I imagine a big draw was money, but what else was there? To me, there had to be something else. The competition, they had to be displeased with the National or American League to want to jump. Why jump? I mean, you had players like Chief Bender, Mordecai Brown, Bill McKechnie, Eddie Plank, Eddie Roush. Why did these players jump from, I'm going to call it the major leagues, to the Federal League?
Well, I mean, the two reasons, as you said, I mean, one was money. The increase in salaries were tremendous. Now, a lot of times baseball would match those and sort of drag the player back by matching or actually offering more money. The Federal League, because of this blacklist, was often forced to offer 2 or 3 year contracts guaranteed by the owners. So a lot of times you're getting 2 and 3 year contracts guaranteed by owners. There's a number of players who, after the league folded, were still getting paid because they had these personal services contracts with the owner. The other is that the playing conditions at the time were just unbelievably bad. I mean, the owners just treated the players just horribly. I mean, one of the things there wasn't actually a union that had some clout during this time because, and I mean, when you looked at what a lot of this stuff is more in the minors than the majors, but the stuff that the union demanded were things like players get a copy of their contract. If they're released, it's in writing. I mean, the team will pay for the uniform. I mean, the kind of stuff. I mean, you can just, it's just crazy. I mean, Wade Hoyt, the fella just came out and got with Tim Manners. What was his name? Anyway, there was this book on Wade Hoyt, and Wade Hoyt, who was just a young player in the minors at the time, talked about how, the Giants, he'd been farmed from the Giants to a minor league team, and those two teams had a conflict, and neither team paid him his last paycheck. They both said get it from the other, and he had no recourse. So it was just a brutal time.
You used the term blackball. In 1941, I think it was, the Mexican League tried to fashion itself as a major league, and some of the ball players jumped there. Sal Magli, Mickey Owen, Max Lanier, several others. Commissioner at the time was Happy Chandler, and he banned any player who did not return to the majors by 1946 for 5 years. Baseball didn't have a commissioner back in 1914 and 1915. So who was in charge of the National League, and who was in charge of the American League back then? And was there talk of imposing some sort of bans on those who did jump to the Federal League?
Absolutely. So Ban Johnson, who was the president of the American League.
Ban, and we're talking about ban.
That's right. And he was the driving force behind the American League in 1901, and he was the most powerful man in baseball. The president of the National League was a guy named John Tenner, who had just been governor of Pennsylvania, and the National League wanted someone with some stature to be their president. Tenner had actually once been a player back in the around 1890, and he was sort of more reasonable than Johnson. And then, of course, Gary Herman was the third member of this National Commission, as I mentioned, and those three were setting the rules. But Johnson, the American League basically followed Johnson's lead. So Johnson had a league behind him, and if he said something, he knew his league would follow him. The National League owners were extremely fractious. They just didn't get along with each other. They went a lot of different directions. So the National League was always more disorganized than the American League, which gave Johnson a much stronger base to sort of try and impose his will on stuff. So it was Johnson that was clearly pushing the blacklist, and they did. I mean, there was an article, there was a letter from Ban Johnson to Gary Herman in the Herman papers, and this was, I think this was actually in 1913, even before the 1914 season, and in it Johnson had clipped out some little agate type, art from a newspaper, just a little agate type thing that said, Joe Dokes, some guy no one had ever heard of, had just jumped to the Federal League from some like Class B minor league. And Johnson said to Herman, let's make sure we get this guy on the blacklist. This was really intense. And, if you never actually played in the Federal League, you could come back. So one of the strategies of the major leagues was, if a Federal League signed a guy, just go sign them back and make the Federal League sue us. So that was a key strategy. So if you've never played in the Federal League, grab them back. But once they played, they were blacklisted. Now, just as an aside, at the end, when the Federal League folded, there was the settlement, and a lot of the Federal League owners were actually bought out. And as part of that settlement, the players were allowed back into baseball, although I think there was still some sentiment. I think some players may have been stuck in the minors longer than they otherwise should have been.
All right, I'm going to read this straight from what I wrote down. In 1914 and 1915, the National League consisted of the Boston Braves, the New York Giants, the St. Louis Cardinals, Chicago Cubs, Brooklyn Dodgers, Philadelphia Phillies, Pittsburgh Pirates, and Cincinnati Reds. The American League consisted of the Boston Red Sox, the Detroit Tigers, Chicago White Sox, the Washington Nationals, the New York Yankees, St. Louis Browns, Cleveland Indians, and the Philadelphia Athletics. The Federal League placed teams in Brooklyn. There was a National League team there. St. Louis, there was a National League team there. There was an American League team there. Chicago, you had the White Sox and you had the Cubs. They also went to Indianapolis, Baltimore, as you've mentioned, Buffalo, Kansas City, and Pittsburgh, where the Pirates were. How and why were those cities chosen?
Well, I think part of it was where you could find owners and where you could get ballparks. And I think that one of the things to understand is that the four teams that did not have major league teams, they felt that they were major league. I mean, Baltimore had a major league team in the 1890s. Heck, they had a major league team as late as 1902. They felt like they were a major league city, and they wanted a major league team. Kansas City felt like it should be a major league city. Indianapolis felt like it should be a major league, and Buffalo. Don't forget, Buffalo had a National League team, in the 1880s. That was good. I mean, so these teams were not all that far removed from having been major league. Now, the problem with what happened in these cities is that they did not have one wealthy owner. They had teams went out and sold stock. Yeah, I mean, so you got a bunch of people paying $100, and you'd raise, you'd raise your $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever it was you needed at the time at $100 to $1,000 at a time from a bunch of small investors. And the problem with that is that when you inevitably started losing money, and just as a side, this was before the Security and Exchange Commission. So, the people selling the stock, sort of the organizers of this, could make any claim that they wanted. They would talk about how Charles Comiskey, started as a player and now was a rich owner, and that could be you too. I mean, it was incredible claims that everybody made. But the problem with this setup was that if you didn't make money, you didn't really have any deep pockets to help fund it, because a guy who puts up $200 to buy, a small percentage of the Indianapolis team is not going to write a check for $50 when, they lose $50,000 that year. And that's where Robert Ward was sort of funding all of these losses for these teams. The Baltimore team did really well. The Baltimore team was probably the second most successful behind Chicago. And, but, so there was a real sense that those four cities could in fact support major league teams. They felt they were major league. They had grown in population. Baltimore was a top tier city in population. Baltimore and Buffalo were both bigger than a number of cities in the major leagues. And they, and the fans there obviously preferred to be major league. As I was mentioning, Baltimore's Federal League team far outdrew its high minor league international league team.
Mm-hmm. I would think some of the cities, I guess, were also chosen based off the fact they didn't have Major League Baseball, which, of course, later on brought about the barnstorming. You would take these Major League ball players would get together and go barnstorm in cities during the off season that never had an opportunity to watch a Major League game. So you did put a team in Indianapolis and Buffalo, Baltimore, and at the time, Kansas City. What teams were the better teams, and how competitive was the league?
The league was pretty competitive. I mean, the teams actively tried to sort of make it competitive. The Chicago team was the best. They won the pennant in 1915. I think they came in second or third in 1914. Indianapolis won in 1914. Just one interesting comment on the Indianapolis team. After the season, Harry Sinclair, who was of Sinclair Oil, probably, almost richer than Robert Ward, if anybody. I mean, he was richer than anybody, the oil man. And again, he, as your listeners may know, he went to jail for a short time as part of the Teapot Dome scandal in the 1920s. But he bought the Indianapolis team and moved him to Newark. And the Indianapolis team didn't want to move, but I mean, all the owners didn't want to allow him to move it, but they didn't really have any choice because they couldn't fund the deficits. But it was a competitive league. Baltimore was always competitive. I mean, the 1915 season, if you count the Federal League as major, was the closest pennant race of all time. The two teams effectively, Chicago and the second place team effectively finished tied. One was I should go back and look at the book, but one was like 85 and 65, and the other was like
Yeah, they
86 and 66.
games, so they won
Yeah.
off a win percentage. I think maybe it was Pittsburgh or something
Yeah. Pittsburgh. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and Pittsburgh, they had, yeah. And the other thing is, I mean, just they had a doubleheader the last day, and Pittsburgh had to beat Chicago twice, and they only beat them once, and so Chicago won. But you know that, and that was in Chicago, and they drew huge crowds. I mean, Chicago was still, even in 1915, when things were looking a little bit grim for the league, Chicago was still really excited around that Federal League team.
We talked about some of the players who jumped from the major leagues to the Federal League. Who were, if you know this, some of the players who were some of the players who got their start in the Federal League and after the Federal League disbanded, jumped to the majors and became stars in the majors?
Well, Ed Roush was the main one. If he played in the majors before the Federal League, it was only 1 or 2 games. And, you know, he's now in the Hall of Fame. He was an outfielder for Cincinnati for most of his career. But he was clearly the main one that would have been discovered by the Federal League. There was several pitchers that got their start in the Federal League that went on for a while, but you know, not a lot were brought in young, started in the Federal League, and then went on to really good. You mentioned Billy McKechnie. He was relatively young when he went into the Federal League.
Did the defection of players from the American and National Leagues to the Federal League shift the power of any teams in the NL or AL, or which teams suffered the most from defections?
You know, the ironic thing is that the Philadelphia Phillies probably suffered as much as anybody, and yet they won the 1915 National League pennant, which was their first pennant. So it just goes to show you can never really predict baseball. You know, William Baker was the owner of the Phillies, was notoriously cheap, notoriously annoying, and you know, when players could get out of there, they got out of there. And but nevertheless, Pat Moran was his manager, made a number of brilliant trades. One of the sort of interesting stories that just go to that a little bit is at the end of the 1914 season, the Federal League had a successful raids and actually signed about 18 players from the major leagues, a number of them from the Phillies, and that was going to be a key turning point. And the major leagues came and basically signed them all back. Not every single one of them, but about 15 of the major ones. And as part of that signing them back, a lot of the players who wanted to get out of particular cities, such as Philadelphia, the major league teams would trade for those players. So a lot of like Paul Parrott went to the Giants, Bob Bescher went to the Giants. So some of these players, so the Giants traded some players to the Phillies, got the rights to these players, and then signed them back. But the players that the Giants traded were better than the guys that they got. So in fact, the Phillies made out really well out of this sort of crazy trying to get the players back to the majors to get them to a place that they want. And the Giants obviously gave up too much for him. It was John McGraw was the man of the Giants. I mean, it was one of his very few kind of misreading of player abilities.
Was there ever talk of any sort of merger? In other words, you have the National League and you have the American League. Was there ever a thought of adding the Federal League and making Major League Baseball, for lack of a better term, a 3-league organization?
No. But what did happen at the end of the 1914 season is that everybody figured if there could be a settlement, that would be good. And Charlie Wiegeman from Chicago was sort of the driving force. And there was this agreed upon, there was a discussed settlement, and exactly who agreed on what is hard to figure out because, you know, you're going from these letters. And there was this, that the owners of the Federal League teams would be given teams in the high minors, like the International League and the American Association, and that the draft would be gotten rid of. So essentially part of organized baseball was that teams in higher leagues could draft players from teams in lower leagues. So at the end of the year, the majors could draft teams from AA. There was no AAA then, and AA could draft from A. And that was partially because you had this hierarchy of leagues, and it was partially because there was no other way so that would allow players to advance. If a player was good, otherwise a player could be trapped in, the III league in some small town in Iowa for his whole career. So, and to get rid of the draft, which would make these high minor leagues feel more major, even though they wouldn't be major, there would be a different feel to them because they could control their players for longer. That quickly blew up. That settlement, because when a push came to shove, the Federal League said they weren't willing to do that. But Wiegman sort of cut a deal on the side where he was going to buy the Cubs. He was going to allow Robert Ward was going to buy a team somewhere. So they were each going to be able to buy a major league team, and then they were going to amalgamate. They were going to do this amalgamation of the Federal League into the high minors, and the other Federal League owners completely misread their bargaining power, and they said, no, we're going to push back on this. And part of what happened is that, just relative to sort of negotiating power, if Wiegman had been able to buy the Cubs in advance, he could have said, look, I'm going to the Cubs, I'm disbanding this team, you guys are on your own. They would have settled for just about anything. But Wiegman couldn't buy the Cubs because the Cubs backed out at the last minute. So he couldn't buy the Cubs in 1914, as he did as part of the settlement after 15. So he couldn't buy the Cubs. He had no leverage. The other Federal League owners misread their leverage, went and said, no, we're not going to do this. We want to be major league. And the major league owners said, go pound sand. And that was that. So there was a lot of settlement talk after 14. And there was a lot of ways it could have happened under different circumstances.
What ultimately led to the failure of the Federal League? Why did it not succeed?
Well, I mean, they had to pay too much for the players because of the antitrust, because the players were going to get blacklisted and all the other stuff that was said about them. They were having to pay 2 and 3 year contracts to be able to, so the player would feel like, if on a 1 year contract, if the league failed, what am I going to do? So they were guaranteeing 2 and 3 year contracts. They were paying a lot of money. Two is the major leagues had this incredibly, they just out-lawyered them at every opportunity. There was a couple of places where the Federal League would sign players. They signed Walter Johnson, the great pitcher, the greatest pitcher of the era.
Sure.
And the organized baseball sent a bunch of folks there. They put pressure on Johnson, and Johnson then signed back with the major leagues. He broke his Federal League contract. And there were 2 spots, one at the end of 1914, as I mentioned, when Johnson signed and a bunch of other players signed. And there was one in the middle of 1914 where it looked like a bunch of players might jump, and the major league owners and their attorneys sort of outmaneuvered them in the courtrooms so that the players couldn't jump or decided not to jump to the Federal League, given the uncertainty of the legal situation. And so A, they were out-lawyered. B, it just cost them a ton. And C, other than Chicago, they couldn't really get traction. In Brooklyn, the Dodgers just got a lot more attention than Ward's team, and in Pittsburgh, it was the same thing. In St. Louis, couldn't support 3 teams. I mean, in St. Louis,
they had the Cardinals, the Browns, and the St. Louis Federal team.
Right. And, so all the teams just struggled in St. Louis. So, it was too expensive. And, the other thing that happened is Robert Ward, who was funding everybody, died in October of 1915. And so at that point, I think that there was no one else who was going to fund all the losses. Even though Harry Sinclair was in Newark, he wasn't quite as inclined to fund every other team in the league like Robert Ward was.
Going back to Judge Landis, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the lawsuit, how did he manage to do that? How did he manage to drag things out? And by dragging everything out, these lawsuits out, these decisions, rulings, wasn't that the main catalyst for the Federal League ultimately failing?
Well, it was in the sense that the Federal League couldn't get antitrust relief, right? I mean, they filed the suit in January, and Landis would just sort of delay ruling. I mean, he delayed ruling until the end of the 1915 season. And so the Federal League could never get antitrust release for all the stuff that I've talked about that dragged on him, the blacklist, the negative talk about about that the Federal League's going to fail, don't go there, the conversation, the respecting of contracts, so that they could never get any and one of the things the Federal League was asking for was that all these players you just signed back from us basically illegally, where they broke their contracts. Besides, there was Walter Johnson, and there was a bunch of other guys too. There was about 15 players, and so they couldn't get those players back. So sure, yeah, I mean, I think that if the Federal League had antitrust protections, it would have been a very different battle.
Of the owners, the teams, the players, who benefited the most after the league folded? Did the owners get any benefit out of it? Did the players? And what happened to those teams? They're just gone, poof, gone?
Yeah, I mean, the Federal League owners got paid off a little bit. Overall, the total settlement was probably about $700,000 that went to the teams that were still around. So the Ward family, they got $20,000 a year for 20 years. Sinclair got $20,000 a year for 10 years. So, I mean, they were, some of them, it wasn't a lot compared to how much they lost. I mean, they probably were losing, the Wards talked about losing, $650,000. So, no, the Edward Gwinner in Pittsburgh complained that, he didn't get anything out of the settlement and lost all this money. All these little investors in Indy or Baltimore, I mean, they lost all their money. The players had a couple of years of really nice salaries. I mean, they were doubling and tripling. Players who were making $2,500 were making $6,000. Of course, in 1916, the owners just shut it all off and just went back to paying pre-Federal League war salaries. And, and the players were really unhappy. And in fact, there was actually some union action in the off season of 1916, 1970, where the union was actually going to try and make a stand and was completely crushed by the owners. I mean, that was really the last union action until, Robert Murphy after World War II tried to organize a union. In the aftermath, the owners benefited because they were back to the status quo ante, and they got this antitrust protection going forward, which they didn't have any reason to believe they were going to get. So just as an aside, after the settlement, the Baltimore Federal League team said, we don't want money. They were offered somewhere around $50,000 to $75,000 to go away. And they said, we don't want money. We want a major league team in Baltimore.
Sure.
They were talking about trying to buy the St. Louis Cardinals and moving the Cardinals to Baltimore, or any team that they could get in Baltimore. And, the owners just said, look, we're going to give you this, otherwise go away. And so it was Baltimore that filed this antitrust suit. It was not the league itself. The other the other owners, Sinclair and Ward, or the Ward family and Weigman, they just wanted nothing to do with the Federal League anymore. And so Weigman was allowed to buy the Cubs. So Weigman bought the Cubs, and as you know, Ball bought the St. Louis Browns. So as part of the settlement, those two men got to buy into the majors, and the other teams went away. Sinclair had controlled the rights to a number of players, which he then sold to the majors. So the Federal League still controlled their player contracts, which they could sell to the majors. And there was, a number of decent players, Benny Koff and Lee McGee and Ed Conici, that Sinclair, or whoever, Gwinner controlled a couple from Pittsburgh that they sold. But, I was the owners who got this unforeseen, undeserved antitrust exemption because Baltimore, filed suit. If Baltimore hadn't filed suit, nothing had ever happened. At some point in the 30s, 40s, 50s, baseball would have been told they didn't have an antitrust exemption just like anybody else.
Right. Just recently, Major League Baseball included Negro League stats into official Major League Baseball stats. I believe that ultimately Federal League stats were absorbed into official stats. I think that's true. And if it is, why did it take so long for Major League Baseball to recognize the individual stats of the players who jump out? Well, the individual stats of Federal League ball players.
Well, there was the group in 1969 that sort of looked at this for official. Sort of officially in 1969, and they sort of ruled on which leagues were major league. And the Federal League was ruled a major league. The Union Association of 1884, which is, I mean, if anything shouldn't be a major league, it's probably that. But you know, it has its champions too. There's people who write books on the Union Association. It's a fun story. But you know, so it was in 1969 that there was a commission put together by baseball to decide what leagues were major, and the Federal League was ruled major in 1969. You know, until then too, you know, it was. You know, the Federal League was an outlaw league, so it was still resented for a long time.
And I think a couple players really benefited from the inclusion of their stats. I think.
Yeah, Eddie Plank got a couple of wins. Chief Bender got a couple of wins. Eddie Roush had 2 years added to his career. So absolutely.
Yeah. What is the legacy of the Federal League?
Well, I mean, the legacy of the battle and between them is that baseball sort of was allowed to ossify into what it became. You know, it was no franchise movement until the 1950s because it could do whatever it wanted to. There was no you know, the population growth in America continued to be extremely large between 1915 and 1961. And it wasn't until 1961 that America put in there that more teams were put throughout America. So I think that the legacy is that it ossified the current situation and gave the owners really the power to do whatever they wanted to in terms of, you know, controlling their league and controlling the sport in America. Remember, I mean, there was no guarantee that leagues were going to evolve the way they did. You know, where you had territorial rights and control over contracts the same way. I mean, look at the Premier League and, you know, in soccer, right? There's this relegation thing. I mean, leagues, there was nothing sort of preordained about the way the league was going to evolve. And the fact that the Federal League lost and how they lost and the antitrust stuff going on there really sort of put in place the situation that, you know, gave the owners the opportunity to create these leagues in the way they wanted to.
Well, Dan, I want to thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. This is another one of those topics where we could talk and talk and talk. I mean, it's really fascinating stuff, and you certainly do know your stuff. You wrote the great book. Wow, really good. And I want to, again, thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
So the Federal League existed as a major league for 2 years, 1914 and 1915. Outside of the Mexican League of the 1940s and the attempted start of the Continental League in the early 1960s, there hasn't been another attempt to start a rival league. Unlike the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, no one has really figured out how to take on Major League Baseball. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest today, Dan Levitt, and thanks to all of you as well for your support, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, you know, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.